Welcome to the Pitcwerks podcast. I'm Scot McTaggart. Over the last 20 years, I've been a sales rep, a marketer, a manager, an executive, a consultant, and an advisor. This show is designed to give you access to my list of contacts so that you can learn more about how to present your ideas at work and succeed in your career.
Startups and salespeople, marketers and managers from the Epicast Network in Pittsburgh. It's the Pitchwerks podcast.
If you're pitching, I'm sitting there with a checklist, and I want to know, do you know who your users are?
Yeah.
The people that consume the value that you're going to produce. Do you know what that value even is? What need you're actually meeting?
Yeah.
And if you like Clayton Christensen's model, like jobs to be done, what job the thing that you're building is supposed to do, what they're hiring you to provide?
Right.
If you don't know that, then you're in deep trouble.
Hey everybody, it's Scott. It's Wednesday and it's the Pitchwerks podcast. Thanks for tuning in. As always, this week, Ben Mosior, hiredthought.com is where you can find him and his various and sundry writings. I highly recommend the trip. Ben is here to talk to us, amongst other things, about how it is that you are identifying and planning what's possible. I really enjoy talking to this gentleman. I think you will like hearing what we have to say. Before we jump into the conversation, I'm going to ask you to rate and review this fine program on iTunes. Give us a star rating. Give us a review. Tell us what you think about our work here at Pitchwerks, and do that. We'll be friends. Let's talk to Ben. Check out hiredthought.com. All of his writings are over there. There's some really interesting stuff going on in Ben's head. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome into the studio, Ben Mosior, founder over at Hired Thought. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great, Scott. Thanks for having me.
First of all, let me just say, and this is one of the highest compliments I can give, that you and I had a scheduled 1 hour meeting that turned into, I think, 3 or 2.5. We just kept going. We just kept talking. I'm going to let you do your own talking here in terms of what your work is day to day, but I think as we get started, people need to be looking at this conversation as sort of an examination of how complex your business can be, how complex your workday can be, and what are we doing about it other than just watching it pile up, right?
When I think about business and when I think about life in general, a lot of stuff happens that we're not even aware of. We kind of have this giant ball of mud, which is life. Yeah. Or maybe it's just a giant ball of mud of this business that I'm running.
Well, is it fair to say that the ball of mud of life can get subdivided into a smaller ball of mud called work?
Oh, man. Yeah. It's and that's actually the trick a lot of times is being able to have a moment where you're saying, wait a minute, this part is a little bit different than the rest of it.
Oh God, this mud is different in this place over here.
Yep. And so when you pay attention to it and you start looking closer and closer and closer, you start actually saying, hey, maybe we could call this mud something. And when you have a name for it, different kinds of mud, hey, we can have an intelligent conversation about it. And so,
I don't recall if I said this to you when we sat together or not, but that's actually one of my favorite Confucius quotes of all time was wisdom begins by calling things by their proper names.
It has something to do with this thing called Wardley Mapping, and it's an area that I've specialized in. And the basics of it are you want to start giving things names so that you can have a shared language and have a shared conversation about something that otherwise, I don't know if you've ever been in a room with a client or with someone, you're trying to talk about some sort of business system or some idea, right? Mm-hmm. And you start talking past each other because you're using words and you know that the other person isn't using the word in the same way that you are. And so you go, what do you mean by that?
Right.
And you're kind of
tell me what it means
it.
To you. Yeah. Sounds like aggression. It sounds like I'm calling you stupid.
Yeah, and I tweeted this out the other day. I was like, asking you what that term means as a service and getting confused looks. Like that's the whole thing that I experience all the time. I have to balance this naivety of I want to make sure I understand what it is that you're saying.
Right.
With, I don't want to make you feel like I think you're stupid or something is happening there that's not.
That happens a ton when you're trying to bring new clients into an organization because you have to find people the way they are, right? And then make them confident or at least comfortable that they can tell you what their problem is. And that's how you know whether or not you can solve that pain, right? And you end up a lot of times finding out that people didn't do the vocabulary homework that you did, right?
Or they went to a different school that had a different version of the vocabulary book. And
generationally, you'll see this, right? The one generation called it one thing, and then the younger ones that came after them refined the idea.
Yeah. Something that I used to do a lot of the time back when I was first working in the corporate space was I would look for the perfect definition of some term, because I thought that there was truth there, and I thought that there was like a perfect idea that I could describe with a particular term. And so a lot of my time in meetings was like, what do you mean by that word? And people were just getting so frustrated.
Well, and there's wisdom in this conversation too, because I think anyone who's ever had success looking at like the root of a word or the history of a word, right? Like, okay, if I'll pick an easy one, right? Metric, right? Like, the measurement of something, right? Mm-hmm. Or ology, the study of something, right? You learn these roots and these prefixes and these suffixes, and you say like, now I can use context clues and these, Greek and Latin backgrounds to figure out what people are talking about. And then you get to work. And then you realize that there's not a scientific approach to the way a lot of these things were named. It was literally just like what people called it, or it's a brand name. It may not even be in circulation anymore. And now you've got the problem that you're describing. But people cling to it. They think that if they can get the term, that they can understand their job.
Absolutely. And the different fields that need to use those terms in different ways, that idea inherently conflicts with this idea of finding a perfect version of it.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I had recommended to me a long time ago was to do a little bit of reading, a little bit of research on a philosopher by the name of Wittgenstein. And Wittgenstein is interesting because he had two great works, which is unlike any or most philosophers out there. When you get to the point where you're an expert on something or you're known for something, it's usually like one big thing, right?
Okay.
He found that thing, and then he said, I'm done. I figured it out. My work here is done. I no longer need to be a philosopher. And then he came back to it and realized, oh wait, there's something here. So there are a couple interesting interviews on YouTube with some like British philosophers like talking about Wittgenstein and all this kind of stuff. You can look for it.
Nice.
But the main thing that I took away from that was he was after this kind of absolute idea of what is true and like what is a thing.
Yeah.
And what he ended up transitioning to was saying, look, there are families of meanings. And you know what? What I really need to be doing is looking at the way that you're using that word. And if I can angle myself around that, understand what you're saying, what you're intending to say and how you're using it, then honestly, there doesn't need to be one single definition. I just need to have a common understanding.
I need to know algebraically how to substitute in your idea for the notation you're using conversationally.
Yeah, I'll be honest, this is something that happens to me all the time when it comes to methodology.
Yeah.
So I'm sure you've heard of like Kanban before.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. The Trello is based on it, right?
Yeah. There's this.
If you say Trello, people get it. If you say Kanban, they don't.
Absolutely, and that's because Kanban is like this particular like context specific methodology inside the Toyota production system, and it was sort of like. There are a couple good books by Mike Rother around this subject, but like the intention there was to enable stuff that none of us are thinking about when we say Kanban. So like in Toyota production system, there are like concepts like pull versus push. There's this idea of single piece flow. And like what happens is we take those away as like good or bad things. And we're like, let's take that good thing and just replicate it here. And in fact, like we can't because we don't have the same context.
It's not substitutable.
And that's where, I guess my bread and butter is context and becoming aware of context and giving it names and talking about it. And maybe not focusing on truth, but focusing on what's useful right now to make a decision about something that's important to us.
So tell me about Wardley Mapping. You mentioned that early on, and I want to understand what that is. Originally, I think I was under the impression that this was like your company or a thing that you do. Tell me how I'm wrong.
It's one of the areas that I've specialized in, and it's kind of more about the time that I got into it than anything else.
Okay.
So Wardley Mapping is a visual method for really exploring, understanding, and sharing strategy.
Okay.
And so it was invented by someone by the name of Simon Wardley, and he works for an organization called the Leading Edge Forum. And he's released this method, basically Creative Commons, share alike.
Wow.
So anybody can learn it, anybody can use it, anybody can build businesses around it. But the point is, he wants people to know about it and to learn it and to really start applying it to their business. And what it is ultimately is understanding what the parts of the system that you're involved in are, and then talking about what you want to do to them and with them on this thing that he calls the landscape, which is the context that you're in, It's kind of like the board in a game of chess, like understanding that there
What's
is
within
a board.
the borders, the boundaries?
Yeah. What are the rules of the game? What are the capabilities that you have? And what are the general patterns of how to approach the kind of work that you're trying to do?
So is it fair to say that when people hire you, they are either poised for a massive change that they think will benefit them, or they're trying to steer out of a slide that they don't understand? Like, is that kind of what your clients feel like? It's either like we know something big is coming and we're afraid of its size and scope, or we don't know why we're sliding backwards down the mountain.
Yeah, it does tend to be around this like general state of like what is happening right now. Like I thought I understood the rules of the game. I thought I understood how to make this decision, and you know what? Something isn't right, and I can't tell what it is.
Right.
So
you have to go and you have to challenge all your assumptions.
Yeah, and frankly, it's really hard to challenge assumptions like in the abstract, right? So part of what Wardley Mapping does is it forces you to visualize it and then put it on the wall and point at it and go, "What is that?
And,
what the
and
hell
do
is
we
that?"
need it?
Yeah.
And if we do need it, do we need it more than other things? Is that fair? Prioritization figures in too?
Absolutely. Well, and that's actually, I would say that's the thing, right?
Okay.
Is as a business, you have limited time, energy, money. I feel like you and I were parroting each other when we were talking earlier. It's just, there's only so much we can put into the world right now. And so we'd better focus.
Well, the reason I think we parrot each other is because what you're talking about is a structured version of ideas that have nagged me for years. And I don't think I'm alone in that.
No.
And if there's anything that I'm hoping for your benefit of being, here in our studio is I'm not sure that everyone who can benefit from this nagging thought. I've been trying to put form to these ideas for some time. Like I mention accountability a lot. I mention complexity a lot. I mention this idea of calling things by their proper names rather than allowing euphemism to hurt your business, right? Like there's all kinds of these different things. Like, well, we will have success if sounds like a really useful sentence. If you don't know what success's definition is, then it's not at all useful. It's actually wasted effort.
There's this interesting shift that comes to mind when you say that, which is a shift from this means ends kind of thing, where we think that if we just accomplish that one goal, that's success.
Right.
That's it. And we'll have it nailed, and that's all we'll ever need, right? Mm-hmm. Because we tend to think in short term, like kind of thinking, right? So we think, okay, if I do this thing, then I'll get that outcome, and I just do it, right? So
right.
I hit it with a hammer as hard as I can, and hopefully it works out. It turns out this nasty thing that we call complexity that I think you and I are super interested in.
Yeah.
Rears its ugly head, and sometimes things aren't so predictable, and sometimes you can't actually accommodate the inherent ambiguity or the questions that sort of arise from that. And so when you are confronted with that kind of situation, what do you do?
What is success? Is it being busy? No. Is it having high revenue? Probably not, unless the profits are there within the revenue. So is it having high profit? Maybe. Depends on whether or not those profits are low enough to spur enough volume. And now we're right headed down complexity lane, which is where I have a feeling you have a summer home.
I do. I have several properties in this
on complexity lane.
Yeah, I have a lot of bones to pick, and frankly, like a lot of the times when people have a great idea, they really just want to try to do it. And I think a lot of our cultural values say, if just go out and do it, make it happen. It's part of like the American dream to pull yourself by your bootstraps and go
all
out,
by yourself,
make it happen.
Team of one.
But I tell you what happens when I go to like a pitch competition, right? So I sit down and I listen to the ideas that are being said. And this is frankly like one of the best introductions to Wardley Mapping that I think I could ever offer.
Yeah.
If you're pitching, I'm sitting there with a checklist and I want to know, do you know who your users are?
Yeah.
The people that consume the value that you're going to produce. Do you know what that value even is? What need you're actually meeting?
Yeah.
And if you like Clayton Christensen's model, like jobs to be done, what job the thing that you're building is supposed to do, what they're hiring you to provide.
Right.
If you don't know that, then you're in deep trouble.
Well, that's they say, like, what pain are you solving? What problem are you solving, right? And that's that sort of like street level vernacular that we dress it up in. The problem with using street level vernacular is that it makes it seem as though it's not that important, right? It's like, well, if you can give me a slouchy answer, then that's how you know you truly understand it. And I'll go a different way, and I'll say, I don't just want to know what problem you're solving. I want to know, are you solving it better than the other options? And here again, we're coming down your street. Kind of complexity lane rears its head again. It's like, okay, well, the iPhone solved the problem of having access to the internet at a moment's notice. Was that really better than going to a computer? The market said yes. Now, is the app on the iPhone that you get that does a different kind of text messaging that much better than the iMessages that comes shipped on the phone? These are the degrees of solving the problem.
Yeah, and I'm going to throw this out there. Chances are, if you have a great idea right now, the last thing you should be doing is building an app. I'm going to say that 100 times at any opportunity.
You're among friends.
Yeah, and the reason for that is, frankly, so there's this wonderful designer by the name of Erica Hall, and she's written some excellent books on design and thinking about how this space overall. One of my favorite is about user research. And I think her take on this is basically, until you can find 10 people to walk through this idea with and actually do it for them without an app.
Without any software, yeah.
Yeah. If you can't do that, then there's no way you should be blowing the money, time, energy, effort, anything on building software.
We did a show like this where Jen Yosef from Mighty had spent something like 6 months with index cards and a flow chart on a wall. This sounds like somebody you would really enjoy their company, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that the problem is the bottleneck in the process is idea validation, right? You don't want to invest money until you know that it's worth the investment.
Yeah.
And starting with software is like the opposite of the thing you want to do, because frankly, when you start building software, it starts getting hairy and it starts getting complex. And frankly, we like to think of it like it's mechanical. Like it's just parts in a machine. And
cheap. We also like thinking of it as being disposable, cheap, fast, those kinds of things.
Not to mention, like when you start thinking about outsourcing, like the labor part of that, like you increase the amount of communication problems that are inherent with that, just because you're dealing with people in different time zones. And
that part makes me nervous, just because I'm on record 100 times saying, if you can't do the work, you can't judge the work, right? You don't know how well it's been done. It's super hard,
yeah. And frankly, I think the only circumstance I've heard where that makes a lot of sense is if the person doing the hiring and outsourcing is also in software.
Right.
So that the whole thing is a giant mess. Mm-hmm. And frankly, going out there asking people to help you build an app is kind of like wasting their time until you've validated the concepts behind it.
So do you have a lot of software companies? Are software companies hiring you, in a disproportionate rate as opposed to other things?
Well, let me put it this way. I don't think there are companies out there doing novel work that aren't software companies.
Interesting.
And what I mean by that is not that you may identify as a traditional software company. What I mean is, in this quote unquote digital age, every company is enabled by technology. Every company has to have some literacy in this respect. And so if you are doing something and it is completely outside of technology, then I think you're probably the exception rather than the norm.
Interesting. So you're saying yes, but not because of something inherent to you, more just in terms of something inherent to the larger market.
So one of the first things that I do, and this is sort of going to finish the checklist, going back to the startup pitch analogy, right? So if you can identify your users, great. If you know what they need from you, what pain they have that you're going to relieve, fantastic. Whatever framework you're going to use to sort of figure that out, if it's personas, if it's about like jobs to be done, whatever, great. Now do you understand the work that it's going to take to actually meet that need? Which parts are places where you're going to have to do a ton of experimenting and exploring and figuring out and sort of mucking about in complexity? Which parts are the complete opposite of that?
Yeah.
Where the problem's already solved, you just need to pick up the pieces off the shelf or outsource them or whatever it ends up being. So in your average app right now, so as an example, let's say I'm going to build the next Uber for pet grooming or something like that, right? So I'm going to do that, right? And the first thing I'm going to do...
I know it wasn't intended to be funny, but it was funny.
Okay. Well, you got to come up with these like fun examples.
Especially on the spot, yeah.
Well, and they're odd enough to be like, is that real?
I guarantee you it's been pitched at least twice today. Twice today. So like, if the first thing you do when you think about that idea is to go buy a server and then put software on it, say like an operating system, and then actually build software to run on top of that operating system, and then connect it to a network, and then try to figure out the rest, I guarantee you're gonna be in for a lot of pain. Because the first thing you should do is sort of pay attention to the fact that, hey, you know what? You don't need to own a server to do software. Right.
You actually have all these options available to you. Like serverless is probably the thing you should be getting into right now, regardless of where you are. Not that you should start over and just go that place if you're an existing enterprise, but you should start playing in that space now so you don't don't fall behind, basically. But if you're starting from scratch and you have no other considerations, start with something like serverless and start paying attention to what that's possible and capable of. And frankly, from there, you've got things like Heroku, you've got all these other, basically app hosting as a service, right?
Right. Yeah.
So you don't have to pay attention to things like scaling as much.
But you're illustrating this idea of people spending money before it's been legitimized. You can't confirm that the spend is a good spend because you haven't solved a problem, or at least you in your mind, you might believe that you've solved the problem, but you haven't validated externally, right?
Yeah.
And you haven't prioritized what the next step is. You haven't thought in terms of like what is the next logical frictionless step so that you have a backup or back out or a way to come out of this with, I don't even know how to say it. It's like you want to reduce your risk, reduce your loss. Yes?
Yeah. You want to minimize the numbers of places that you have to focus.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is the thing about Wardley Mapping that's really important to pay attention to, is this idea of, in your business, you're going to have to do some work in order to meet those needs. And so at the start of, it's just kind of like a ball of mud like we were talking about before, but if you start paying attention to it and taking it apart and say, okay, you know what, actually, in order for us to build Uber for pet grooming or whatever.
Still funny, I'm sorry.
We're going to have to pay attention to like the different parts of that, right? So what's the user journey behind Uber for pet grooming, right? So
right.
You lay that out and you start thinking about what work has to go in to meet those individual parts of the journey. And so, well, guess what? You're going to have to handle all sorts of stuff. You're going to have to handle scheduling. You're going to have to handle what happens when people don't show up. You're going to have to handle making sure that they know to show up and where to go and all this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, like you're going to have to deal with logistics. And so you're going to keep like creating this list of all these different parts of the system that are going to have to exist that you're probably going to have to write some software to actually provide. But after you validated the idea is worth doing in the first place. And frankly, you're going to sit there and go, okay, these are the parts, right? So 5 of them, I can go out onto the internet and I can say, find me some open source projects that are already existing that do these exact things. Like logistics, you don't need to reinvent the wheel all over again.
Right.
A great example is like the login page on your app, right?
Yeah, that's
don't write
really
that from
commonly
scratch.
stolen from somebody else's original base work, and then you dress it up to make it look like your site.
Exactly, and so you have to do this evaluation component by component where you say, how mature is this thing? What's the market like? Is it on the one end, which we call Genesis, which is it's totally undefined, it's not there at all?
Yeah.
Or is it on the opposite end, which is in commodity, where it's completely defined and stable? How do users perceive this thing? If it's in Genesis, it's going to be completely different and weird and kind of frightening, maybe a little bit, but
right.
Cool. It's weird over there. But on the opposite end, it's going to be completely boring. It's part of the everyday life. It's baked into our everyday existence. It's like, think about how often do you think about the power in your house? Do you ever go up to a wall outlet and go, no, I don't know if this is going to work?
Right. No, that's not happened yet. So like
the point is like in commodity, failure is surprising. Right.
Yes.
It's like something is wrong. All right, let's form a search party and figure out what's going on.
Yeah.
But in something that's in Genesis, total opposite side of the spectrum there, it's expected. It should crash and burn, frankly.
Yes.
And that's totally fine. because we're learning something new
Again,
here.
you're giving words to things that I've thought about 100 times, but from my perspective, again, I've spent a good portion of my career on trying to bring technology to the market, right? So I wasn't necessarily involved in the development. I was involved in the education, because you bring a really great idea that's novel, people resist it because now they have to change the way they do things. And that's where I came in. I was doing education, I was doing validation, I was doing sort of like, tell me about your pain. What's interesting is that in the commodity phase, the only real thing to negotiate is price, right? That's all that's left, is like, how much do I pay for it?
And it's going down and down and down and down. And there's frankly
there's nothing else to think about it, right? Like, okay, this thing's been done 100 times. When you look at construction is a great place to talk about commodity. Like, you need to buy concrete. Concrete is concrete. No one is asking for a brand name of it. No one is asking for the kind that has the extra, calcium in it. Like, if it's got extra calcium in it, it's a different product with a different name.
Yeah.
On the other end, the Genesis side, no one is going to build a hospital out of something that they can't prove is going to work.
Right.
So there's tons to negotiate. Like, well, who's going to pay for it if this thing falls into the earth, right? Like, who's going to be responsible if this goes badly, right?
Yeah, there's a difference in variation from one side of this to the other. Like in Genesis, you expect all sorts of different forms of things to be happening. And frankly, half of them are going to be wrong, probably more than that, a lot more than that.
Yeah.
But like when things shift from that stage sort of towards commodity, right? And there's more detail to this than you can sort of like pinpoint different phases along the way. But like the point is, gradually variation is reducing. Like the different kinds of ways that this thing appears it tends to become more convergent over time. And so you have three main different products.
Yeah, because now you're going to talk about the commoditization of the way that the product is made.
Yeah.
Right? And this is a problem we've run into how many times? This is why you had Betamax versus VHS. This is why you have completely legitimate phone platforms that can't reach escape velocity, because people are like, why do I want to have a third phone platform?
The really cool thing about having something a commodity is actually it forms kind of like a building block. So there's this aspect of Wardley Mapping that says basically efficiency enables innovation. And so the idea is things that are super known, super kind of stable, and they're in this commodity phase, they basically form Lego bricks for whatever else you want to build with it.
Right.
So once you have, going back to the idea of like power, like the power on your wall, once you have that in a commodity form, computers are possible.
Computers are possible because you know that the power is not going to come in at different voltages and different power and blow stuff up when it's plugged in.
Yeah, it's like the fish and water kind of analogy, right? So like commodity stuff is all around us and we don't see it because it's just there and it's just working. We don't really pay too much attention to it, but it forms our environment in which we're doing cool new things. And so like, of course, I'm going to use the tools that are in my toolbox, whatever they happen to be, right?
Yeah.
And then I'm going to do something awesome with those. And you know what? When that awesome thing becomes a commodity form in however many years it takes for that to happen, wow, it's added to the toolbox. And now I have one more weird thing to make a combination of new stuff with.
Well, and this is one that I've watched up close and personal is email. So the first commercial email wasn't sent until like 1990, right? I think it was 89, might have been 92. So let's just call it 90. And it sounds like, it's close enough.
It's close enough.
Fax machines were the thing. And then now I still occasionally will get a request for my fax number because it just hasn't, like people haven't gone back and re-edited like their registration form or whatever, but the bones of it are like the fossils of it are still laying around. And it's like, well, most faxes are emails now anyway, but I remember a time when you had to ask if people had an email.
Yeah, and that's just so mind-blowing to me. But you know what? It's important to point this out because one of the aspects of Wardley Mapping is this thing called inertia. Yeah. And I once gave a talk about this where basically I was comparing the institutional space, what the schools that we go to in college and university and all this kind of stuff, they have a very long-term nature about them where they're dealing with basically, they have to keep things running forever and do new stuff and keep that running forever too. Yeah. And so every time they add a new piece of software or whatever it ends up being, like a new way to do online courses for their students, whatever it ends up being, they have to keep it running forever.
Right. Who is it that you wish would call you?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I guarantee you there's some fish out there you haven't caught yet. There's someone where you're going like, I know I could hit the ball out of the park if I got a phone call from a law firm or a health insurance company. Like, who is it that is like your white whale?
I think I really wish that I got more calls from curious executives. Really.
Just in general.
Frankly, like, so the idea is that I can have amazing conversations with people who are running startups, doing all sorts of kinds of things in different verticals, but I just don't see enough curiosity in the executive space.
So I want to give you a small present, right?
Okay.
You can't touch it, right? I'm sorry. I'm a consultant. This is the kind of thing I do,
Okay,
right? I give people things that they can't actually, physically.
I'm not going to touch it.
Yeah. Okay, it's getting weird. I'm going to give you a way to make that executive more curious, right?
Okay.
And it's from my background, right? Like, again, I can't do what you do, but hopefully I can help other people see the value of what you do. Storytelling is key with complex ideas. Storytelling is 100% where you need to go, but you've got to get their attention first, right? So earlier when we were in this conversation, I said something about like, there are people who know they're setting out for a big Hobbit-like adventure, right? And there are people who don't understand why they like the plane continues to plummet, right? Like they're just like in panic mode. They don't know what to do next, right?
Yep.
I think you start with that and you just say, I'm the person that you call when you recognize that you have a short period of time to figure out a complex strategy. Because time is the trigger. At some level, I've always known I would get around to figuring out the things that you're figuring out, but you're doing it more quickly because it's what you focus on. So what I'm buying when I buy from you is the abridged version. I'm cutting the line at Disney World and getting right on the roller coaster if I hire you. As opposed to hoping that I'm the one that figures it out fast enough. Yeah. That feels right.
It does.
I'm going to have you come back at some point because I think we only just scratched the surface. We can find you at hiredthought.com, yes?
That's right. And one of the top posts on there right now up in the featured section is an intro to Wardley Mapping. If you give that a read, feel free to drop me a line. I'd love to talk to you. I'm very accessible on the Twitters and by email and such.
That's fantastic. I feel oddly validated, right? Like I'm not the only person who had some of these thoughts, but I'm really glad that I can kind of not figure it all out for myself. Thanks for coming in, Ben.
Thanks a lot for having me.
All right, that's the end of the ride. Thanks for checking us out this week. We're going to be back next week. Remember, subscribers get it first every Wednesday morning. And yeah, if you like what Ben's talking about in terms of the way things get planned and mapped and strategized, you should definitely check out hiredthought.com. You can contact him through, as he calls it, the Twitters. P.S. You can find us on there as well. Also Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, all the usual places. Check us out. Find out what we're up to. Suggest guests if you like. We're pretty open to that sort of thing. We'll catch you next week. Take care of yourselves in the meantime.
The Pitchwerks podcast comes to you from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. A production of the Epicast Network and McTaggart, LLC. Engineering and production by Buzzy Torek and Nick Miller. For more information, show feedback, and ad sales, visit pitchwerks.com. pitchwerks.com. On social media, find and follow the show on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram using that same brand name, pitchwerks.